I'm Janice Fiamengo, formerly of the University of Ottawa, and this is the Fiamengo File. If you're planning on attending any academic conferences this year, whatever you do, don't joke about ladies' lingerie. Intersectional feminism has taken over most academic associations with often vicious and farcical consequences, as illustrated in 3 episodes I'll discuss today, beginning with 2 events at the International Studies Association, or ISA, once a venue for serious researchers to share their work, and now a humorless, feminist-compliant organization. All 3 incidents reveal an almost inconceivable petty-mindedness on the part of those who claim to care deeply about social justice. The ISA's 2018 conference held in San Francisco is now notorious, at least in the small world of academia, for an incident in which one male scholar in an unguarded moment offended a female scholar and then refused to make a forced apology and has since been suspended from the organization. The incident could not have been more harmless, but it has been earnestly debated in various magazines with relatively few commentators willing to say what is glaringly obvious, that only a group of ideologically possessed academics could have taken it seriously for even one moment. According to the official version, while conference attendees were standing in a crowded hotel elevator, Professor Simona Sharoni, a professor of, wait for it, Women's and Gender Studies at Merrimack College in Massachusetts, asked everyone what floor they wanted. And Richard Ned Lebow, a professor of political theory at King's College London, replied, ladies' lingerie. It's an old joke from the time when department stores employed elevator operators to take shoppers to the floor they wanted. But instead of laughing it off, or even if really necessary, telling him why the joke was offensive to her, Professor Sharoni said nothing at the time, but later filed a formal complaint with the ISA, which decreed that an apology must be forthcoming. Perhaps as a 77-year-old, decorated scholar, winner of the International Security Studies Award from the ISA and Fellow of the British Academy, Professor Lebow felt less need than more vulnerable early career men to bend the knee, though I assume he was counseled to swallow his pride and make the apology by many around him. ISA past president Craig Murphy of Wellesley College wrote to the Chronicle of Higher Education in a display of exquisite feminist sensibility to say that he hoped Professor Lebow would come to see the need to make amends for having said something offensive. Professor Sharoni, for her part, explained that although she was exhausted by the burden of, quote, confronting sexism in the academy, end quote, she was making the complaint not for herself, cue the violins, but for all women. Predictably, she claimed to have received threats after her complaint went public, and she was outraged that as a, quote, tenured full professor who spent a lifetime researching gender-based violence, end quote, anyone would question her authority to recognize the harms of elevator sexism. Such are dangerous people to be let loose in places where flesh and blood human beings interact. The upshot is that Professor Lebow has been found formally in contravention of the ISA's Code of Conduct, and all power to him is now considering a defamation lawsuit. The author of an essay on this whole affair in the Atlantic magazine chose not to take a side, suggesting cautiously that it was all a matter of perspective, and arguing that what the dispute revealed was that the mechanism the ISA had put in place to deal with these sorts of conflicts was inadequate. Here he spectacularly missed the point. for there is no proper way this dispute could have been handled because basic human relations are not a matter that can or should be dealt with by an overseeing body. The Atlantic writer suggested that a more precise definition of unacceptable conduct would be helpful in future. But I suspect he hasn't realized or refuses to confront that a feminist professor who finds ladies' lingerie unacceptable would surely find many other relatively neutral expressions or actions equally objectionable. Sure, all joking, with even the slightest tinge of sexual innuendo, could be ruled out of bounds if that's what the ISA membership decided. But would that even be sufficient? Sexism can be found by the febrile feminist mind in many other forms of male conduct conveyed through such subtleties as tone of voice, facial expression, or stance. For example, what about standing too close? Or possibly standing too far away? What about making too much eye contact, or perhaps avoiding eye contact altogether, or referring to someone by their first name, or refusing to refer to someone by their first name, or paying too close attention to a conference presenter, or elaborately not paying any attention at all, or holding a door open, or letting a door slam? There is no end to the possibilities, and there is nothing human that could ever be unquestionably safe and inoffensive if one is dealing with child adults. The Atlantic writer probably hadn't heard, as few had, of the predicament that intelligence analyst and adjunct professor Mark Zelinsky found himself in with the ISA in that same year. This is the second incident of so-called misconduct in my roster, and one that likely never could have been forbidden in advance, because this one had nothing whatsoever to do with jokes, harmless or otherwise, but rather with conduct that feminist members of the ISA deemed inappropriate. Professor Zelinsky thought he was simply doing what academics once did all the time, asking challenging questions of conference presenters. But that is no longer allowed when feminist dogma is at issue. Let's back up just a bit. Things started to go wrong for Professor Zelinsky, a member of the International Studies Association, when he learned that he had been chosen to be the discussant. This is somebody who responds to a panel presentation last April 2018 for a presentation at the annual conference. And the presentation was on women, peace, and security, the specific subject being women in conflict and post-conflict situations. He assumed he was chosen because of his expertise in international conflict. He's written a number of books on war and terrorism, with a special focus on militant Islam. I'm sure that doesn't endear him to his detractors either, though that's a subject for another video. So 2 months before the conference, Professor Zelinsky wrote to introduce himself to the female panelists and the panel chair, putting "Hello, women!" in the subject line. That was his first unforgivable sin. Within a couple of hours, he received an email back from the chair of the panel, Laura Soberg, instructing him that he had engaged in wrong speak. She wrote, quote, "All of the panelists may or may not identify as female, but may not be comfortable with the gendered language identifying them, especially collectively," end quote. This gender offense of referring to women as women was later noted in the investigation that was ultimately launched into Professor Zelinsky after a formal complaint was made by 3 female professors: Laura Shepard, a member of the audience at the panel talk, Shweta Singh, one of the panel members, and Soberg, the aforementioned panel chair. The complaint, filed on April 10th, alleged that Professor Zelinsky had violated the ISA's professional code of conduct by asking questions about the panel presentations that feminists did not appreciate. Here is a paragraph from the remarkably hypersensitive complaint. Believe it or not. Quote, This was a feminist panel with 5 feminist scholars presenting feminist work on aspects of gender, peace, and security. Selinsky's opening remark as discussant was to question whether women as a class had in fact been better off under colonialism. His follow-up pondered whether women were better off in Western countries because of the rights and freedoms afforded to women in the West. Neither of these questions had any connection, tenuous or direct, to the subject matter of the material presented. Selinsky made further comments about everyone knowing women who stay in abusive relationships, which had no relevance to any of the themes that surfaced in the papers presented. And when challenged by the chair, a panelist, and an audience member, the discussant refused to acknowledge that it was his own ignorance of feminist theory and gender work which had led him to pose such an inappropriate and racist set of questions, the premises of which have been systematically and widely debunked in decades of feminist scholarship." End quote. I've read out this whole long paragraph because it is the quintessential illustration of the arrogance of the feminist position in its bald declaration that no one who has not already swallowed the feminist Kool-Aid is even allowed to ask non-feminist questions of feminists. One does wonder why, if feminist research has so clearly improved the field of conflict studies, taking it far past Professor Selinsky's allegedly ill-informed premises, why then his questions could not have been easily answered, or even just politely deflected. Why is a lone dissenting voice so intolerable to these supposedly smart women who have done so much to advance feminist research and debunk false ideas? And these academics weren't content with filing their formal complaint. 2 of them quickly went on Twitter to publicly condemn and mock Professor Selinsky. One of them, Laura Shepard, simply could not contain her outrage, saying, quote, "It was absolutely appalling, as if decades of feminist scholarship hasn't systematically debunked this kind of apologia for imperialism. It's not edgy, it's lazy, and I am so far over this nonsense. Seriously, do the work or sit the down." End quote. She also tweeted this rather unrestrained tirade to a professor at Selinsky's place of employment, the U.S. Army War College, obviously in an attempt to bring disgrace to him there. Isn't it reassuring to see feminist professors doing academic scholarship according to the feminist principles of inclusion, empathy, and respect for difference? Don't you look forward to the day when all those in positions of power, rather than just most, will be wise, compassionate leaders like Laura J. Shepard, Associate Professor of International Relations at Sydney University, with expertise in women, peace, and security. So that was the complaint, that Professor Selinsky had shown inadequate deference to feminism. He was ultimately found not guilty of misconduct, though he was let off with a warning, so to speak. The ISA executive wrote to him that it, quote, "does not view the various aspects of this situation as violations of the Code of Conduct. We do recommend, however, that you engage in more thoughtful communications in the future," end quote. So, not technically guilty, in other words, but he hadn't been a good boy either. And this was the beginning of the end for Professor Selinsky, who wasn't interested in being a good boy. Following this first complaint, he attempted to communicate with other ISA members about the ideological bullying he felt he had experienced using the ISA messaging system, and this led to a second complaint, this time anonymous, alleging that he had engaged in retaliation against the original complainants. Gee, I wonder who filed that second complaint. And that he had used the ISA communication system improperly, and he was found guilty of this second charge and was barred from attending the next year's conference. He also later learned that his contract at the U.S. Army War College was not renewed. So here was another blow struck against the patriarchy by valiant feminist warriors. Now, so far, these are two cases of men being punished because they offended feminist women. But the casualties of intersectional feminist ideology can sometimes be women too, as a recent incident at a different academic conference, this time the Society for Classical Studies, clearly indicates. And here, perhaps, is the grim justice of the intersectional social justice movement, as the elite white women who have driven it for many years won't be driving it for very much longer, and in fact must already know that their time in the limelight is ending. More and more, the feminist movement is preoccupied with questions of racism, transgenderism, ableism, Islamophobia, and for all of these and more, white women are useful allies only, so long as they are willing to promote intersectional doctrines and to show deference to those who claim greater marginalization than they. And this fact was starkly illustrated on January 5th of 2019 at a meeting of the Society for Classical Studies in San Diego, California. In the Q&A following a panel called The Future of Classics, and more on that in a minute, an independent scholar named Mary Frances Williams was reported to have uttered a racist statement. It's the kind of moment that causes the entirety of woke academia to draw in an exhilarated breath as the much discussed but oft elusive face of white supremacy is revealed for all to see. It was reported in the Society for Classical Studies newsletter that, quote, an independent scholar told Princeton assistant professor Daniel Padilla Peralta that he got his job because he is black, end quote. As a result, the independent scholar was informed that she had committed racial harassment of Professor Peralta and she was no longer welcome at the conference sessions. Now, in my opinion, if it had been true, and it's a big if, that this was what Mary Frances Williams had said, it would have been a very unfriendly accusation, though not that different from what feminists say about white men in their positions all the time. Regardless, the response of the Society for Classical Studies to Dr. Williams' statement, if she had actually said that, would have been extreme and unnecessary. Professor Dan L. Padilla Peralta is a big boy, literally and figuratively, with a plum position at an Ivy League college. If we're going to talk about privilege and power, he certainly has it over Dr. Williams. She is an independent scholar affiliated with no university, has no academic prestige, has no tenured position, collects no large salary, has no job security, makes no decisions about others' appointments or opportunities, and could not in any universe be seen as a threat to Professor Peralta either personally or professionally. The manner in which her comment was reported guaranteed her professional disgrace. She will possibly never again be invited to present at a major classical studies conference. Surely that is punishment aplenty. But the kicker is that what was reported in the Society newsletter was not what she had actually said. She had actually said, quote, you may have got your job because you're black, but I would prefer to think you got your job because of merit, end quote.
The University of California, Davis, Professor Hexter isn't here. The classics in English courses consist of mythology and vocabulary, and that's it. Okay? So I'm saying Cicero has value, Homer has value, Demosthenes has value because it will teach you about defending democracy. But people don't want that. Okay?
Right. You've listed all men of the authors that you would prefer us to read, by the way.
I am not a socialist, okay? I believe in merit. I believe that the journals have articles on the basis of merit.
Right.
I don't look at the color of the author.
And you don't think that Sappho has merit.
Okay, you may have got your job because you're black, but I would prefer to think you got your job because of merit.
Yeah, we
Okay.
saw that coming.
Say the truth. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, and I think we should allow other people to participate in this conversation at the risk of having this conversation hijacked. But what I'll say simply is that if this vision of the classics is the vision that you find as affirming,
you're saying that people of color, black
let me
people,
finish.
Hispanic people
I let you finish.
They're
so
not
now
capable?
I did not interrupt you once. So you are going to let me talk. You are going to let someone who has been historically marginalized from the production of knowledge in classics talk. And here's what I have to say about the vision of classics that you've outlined. If that is in fact the vision that affirms you and your white supremacy, I want nothing to do with it. I hope the field dies that you've outlined and that it dies as swiftly as possible. And I fervently hope, that those of you in the room will take stock and consideration of what has happened here.
I thought that I would be able to speak. Yeah. I thought that I would be able to speak rather than to be marginalized.
In the interest of equity.
But obviously, your field has decided that there's only a certain point of view.
Go for it. Go for it.
It turns out that the president of the Society for Classical Studies had significantly misreported Dr. Williams' words, causing her ousting from the conference, and yet, to my knowledge, Dr. Williams has never received an apology. And what turns Williams' expulsion into something more than an overreaction and even more than an injustice based on false rumor is the astounding fact that Professor Padilla Peralta had just finished making a speech in which he explicitly called for the advancement of black scholars because they are black.
For this reparative epistemic justice to take hold, holders of privilege will need to surrender their privilege. And in practical terms, this means that in an economy of academic prestige defined and governed by scarcity, white men will have to surrender the privilege they have of seeing their words printed and disseminated. They will have to take a back seat so that people of color and women and gender nonconforming scholars of color benefit from the privileges, career and otherwise, of seeing their words on the page. Again, however, I emphasize that this is an economy of scarcity that at the level of journal publication will remain to a degree zero-sum, until and unless this system of publication is dismantled, which would be fine by me. Every person of color who is to be published will take the place of a white man whose words could have or had already appeared in the pages of that journal. And that would be a future worth striving for. Thank you.
I would recommend everyone watch the entire panel discussion about the future of classics, which is a harrowing spectacle of asinine virtue signaling. But if you don't have time for the entire thing, you should definitely watch the 11 minutes or so of Professor Peralta lecturing the mostly white audience about the need for racial reparations, specifically in academic publishing. As he so eloquently put it, white men must surrender the privilege of seeing their words published and disseminated, and people of color should, quote, take the place of white men whose words could have or had already appeared, end quote, in the classical studies journals. It was remarkable to note the sea of white audience members sitting respectfully and indeed applauding, though perhaps somewhat tepidly, as Peralta informed them that they should look forward to a future in which, because of skin color, they themselves or their children would have to accept racial discrimination and be happy about it. It was in this context that Mary Frances Williams made that comment about Merritt not realizing that the Merritt train left the station long ago. That comment was somewhat aggressive, but it was also conciliatory, an attempt to find common ground with Peralta. She was only wrong in thinking there could be any. So this is where the matter rests, with the Society for Classical Studies unofficially condoning a race-based system of preferences, and Dr. Mary Frances Williams, a relatively powerless female scholar, having been silenced by a powerful man who told her in the Q&A that her vision of the classics, celebrating ancient Greece and Rome as the cradle of Western civilization, must die, and that she can't even launch a defense of it. If there is any satisfaction to be taken in the entire sorry affair, it is perhaps in ironic prediction. Things won't end with the various actors in these mini-dramas. The cycle of blame and self-promotion will continue, leading to oft-repeated accusations and apologies, expulsions, and atonements. All will depend on where one stands in the victimhood hierarchy, and you can bet that Dan L. Padilla Peralta will not always occupy a niche of untouchability. There may be black lesbian scholars who may call out Peralta one day on an inappropriate comment or an exclusionary decision or an oppressive flick of his eyelash. Some of the white feminists mentioned here, so sensitive to patriarchal power, may one day find themselves all out of victim cred and forced to apologize far more thoroughly than they have yet done for their white, cisgendered, and able-bodied privilege. Show trials will proliferate. The whole lot of politically correct scholars may find themselves forced out for various inadequacies and failures, for neglecting to thoroughly enough purge their discipline of whiteness, or perhaps even for sneaking in merit through the back door. Only one thing is for sure. Academia, as we knew it, that bastion of nerdy specialization and beautiful esoteric knowledge and curiosity-driven research, is dead. And the trendy, new, socially relevant so-called scholarship that killed it is a sickly thing likely to be easily picked off by new waves of righteous warriors.